Welcome to the final episode of my invasion deconstruction tutorial. Today we're going to talk about mastering and everything which is connected to mastering. And first things first, I have to mention that this video might be controversial for some of you. So if you're someone who thinks that bass-heavy electronic music has not to be mastered at a certain volume level, then this video is probably not for you. If you think that the loudness war is over and due to streaming services and volume normalization, music has not to be mastered at a certain volume level, this video is probably not for you. If you think that bass-heavy electronic music needs a lot of dynamics, this video is probably not for you as well. That being said, I hope some people are still left. Let's get started, check out the techniques, and explain a little bit. Okay, we already started in the last tutorial a little bit about mixing and the concept behind it, and what I basically do, and I would recommend everyone, is if you have like a decent mix and you have set up everything and the sounds are good, then you can already start to set up a basic mastering chain. And the reason for that is, I can explain it to you, maybe so that it just makes more sense. Okay, let's say you have a decent mix and you're just not mixing into a mastering chain, and then you just you do all the mixing and do the volume balance of all your elements, and then you do a separate master. Then you will, for example, you will set up all the volume levels so that it sounds good to your ears. And then you export the track or export the stems, and then you put a mastering chain on and do some limiting. For example, you like limit 4, 5, 6 dB in general. And then what will happen? Which elements will get limited if you think about it? The loud elements, of course, which are, for example, the kick, like snare in some genres, like the lead sounds, they have bass sounds, maybe the sub bass will get limited a little bit. So the very loud sounds will hit the limiter. So what happens? They will get quieter. And which sounds will not hit the limiter? Like the very quiet sounds, effects sound, like pads, strings, all these little effects shots here and there, and maybe some percussion or drums at a low level, they will not hit the limiter. So what happens? Those elements will not get reduced in volume. So the volume will be increased by the limiter because you drive the limiter into the threshold, and the loud elements will get reduced in volume. So suddenly the volume levels which you have set up will be changed a lot. For example, let's say the kick gets reduced by 5 dB and the pad sound will increase at the same time by 5 dB. So the difference in volume is suddenly 10 dB from the original volume level you set up in your mix, because you have not mixed into a mastering chain. And the problem with that is that always the volume levels will change during mastering. And just for the reason I explained, they will always change, because at the limiting stage, some sounds will get louder, some sounds will get quieter, and you have to take care of that. And the easiest solution is to set up just a basic mastering chain to have the target loudness you want to achieve, and then mix into that chain. Just for the reason that you already know, okay, I have maybe, like, let's say I have 5 dB of gain reduction in my mastering chain. Then I will mix into the chain and I will already have the correct volume levels in all sounds, because I already thought about it that some sounds will get limited and some sounds will not get limited. And the thing also is that some sounds will not survive heavy limiting, and then if you like do all the mixing and go to the mastering, then you will realize, hey, okay, like this sound will not survive the limiting. Or these sounds, if they are layered together, they will create a lot of distortion. They are too loud. The volume levels are not quite correct, and you will get into a lot of problems, and it's really annoying. It takes a lot of time, and then you will go back to the mix, fix it in the mix, then do the mastering again. See, okay, there are still another problem, and it's a lot of going back and forth. And to avoid this problem, the easiest solution is mix into a basic mastering chain. And all the audio schools and all the people, or most people, will say, no, that's not correct, that's not how you do it. But trust me, it works. And the thing about audio and general music production is that a lot of people, they set up some rules, and then they are like kind of set in stone, and people should obey to them. And that's just not how it works. Yeah, rules need to be broken, they have to be broken, and that's how some people got a lot of success. They broke the rules, they did stuff which was not possible before, and simply because it worked. Yeah? And this stuff works. You can just try it out yourself and see how it's done here in my project, for example. And I know a lot of people, and I know a lot of mastering engineers, and I know some mastering engineers who work for the best top-notch industry clients, and they do the same as well. And they do it for a reason, because it's fast, simple, and it gets good results all the time. So I know that some people will say it's wrong, but just give it a try, see how it goes, and if it works for you, then just do it and don't care about what other people say. So what's the concept? All right. I just do the basic cleanup of all my sounds in the mixing stage, and if the sounds are clean and I like how they sound, then I will put on a basic mastering chain, which is usually in my templates already loaded. And basically what is it? It's just the final limiters or clipping stages. So I use firstly, if I talk about the element structure, or the element structure of a mastering chain, then at the end we have a clipper and a limiter. And I already explained a little bit about clipping and limiting. I use a clipper in front of the limiter because I don't want the final limiter has to be limiting all the peaks and very short transients, because it's just not necessary. It will put a lot of work onto the limiter, and it will just create distortion and problems, because limiters, they can't take too much gain reduction without destroying the mix. The best limiters, for example, like here FabFilter Pro L, they can handle maybe 5 to 6 dB gain reduction, but usually after that your mix will fall apart and sound bad. And that's how it is, just how it is. Limiters can only take up like a certain amount of gain reduction, and then they will just fall apart. And so the solution is sometimes you have to do more gain reduction than that to achieve your target loudness. And we use the same concept as in mixing, that on the final mix down we will have some peaks here and there. For example, like on the kick hits we will have some peaks, and if you have like a snare or clap on the kick, maybe the peak is even higher than without these elements. And we already talked about it, short transients can be clipped without audible distortion. And that's why we use the same technique. We clip the very short transients, just like maybe 1, 2, maybe 2 or 3 dB at maximum, and we will clip these transients off. So the final limiter has about like 1, 2, maybe 3 dB of headroom, and then for example the final limiter has just to do like 3 or 4 dB of gain reduction, and it will sound a lot better. So the problem what a lot of people do is they will just throw one limiter onto the mastering chain, and they will not do any limiting in the previous stages. And then they think, okay, I will just put on one limiter and it works. But the problem is it will not work. You will not get to the target loudness you want to. You want to achieve like all the favorite artists you're comparing to. They will have a very fat, thick sounding master at a very high volume, and you can't just get to the same volume level without using techniques like this. You have to use several limiters in different stages to have the sound like very compressed and dense to achieve that loudness. And talking about loudness, a lot of people still don't get it. They say, okay, yeah, the loudness was over because of volume normalization, everything. And yes, to a certain extent, it's like true that some or a lot of streaming services, they do volume normalizations, but the thing is, still a lot of people don't understand why tracks are mastered at a certain level. It's not just about the loudness, it's about the sound that will be created when you master at a certain level. Because just think about it, if you compress a sound very heavily, what happens? The sound gets very upfront, it gets in your face, it gets very thick and aggressive, and in a lot of cases, especially in bass-heavy electronic music, this is exactly the sound you want to achieve. We like distortion, for example. Just think about it. Yeah? Everyone uses distortion all the time in our project. And why? Because it makes stuff brighter, it makes it more like punchier, more upfront, more in your face, and we like that sound. And it's the same in mastering. Mastering engineers master this songs at a certain volume level because it creates a sound that they and their clients like. And not just because it has to be at a certain level. Of course, there are like levels which should be considered, but in the end, it's more about creating this sound they want. And for that reason, they use sometimes a lot of limiting and compressing. And let's say, okay, you think, okay, tracks don't need to be mastered at a certain volume. Okay, let's say, then just go to Beatport top 100 techno chart, download 5 or 10 songs, and then put them in an analyzer. And I will promise you, not even one single track will not be mastered at a certain volume level. And then think about it. Why do the best mastering engineers in the scene, who are mastering for these people? Because they are the most successful people right now, right? And why are they mastering all at roughly the same levels? Because it gets them the result they want. And if you want to have the same result, you have to use the same techniques or similar techniques to achieve this goal. So there are levels which are insanely loud and often not necessary. I'm not talking about putting your mix at like -3 LUFS or something, because that's just insane. But you have to get at, let's say, competitive level, so that your track has or can plays in the same ballpark as your favorite artists. And usually it also depends on a lot of on the genre, because some people say, okay, tracks need a lot of dynamics, but the question is, which tracks are we talking about? Are we talking about classical music, like piano music, jazz music, or are we talking about like really heavy electronic bass-heavy music genres like techno or dubstep, EDM or whatever? Because it's not the same. On these like very bass-heavy genres, we have a very dense, crushed mix and very upfront, in your face, very aggressive. And on like classical music or jazz music, we don't need that. And in these genres, we need a lot of dynamics. And it's true, for these genres, it's absolutely stupid to master the mix at a very high volume, because it just will destroy the overall sound. But in very bass-heavy music, it's necessary to work at a certain volume level. And usually This volume level is maybe around, if you want to be in a competitive area, the loudness in your loudest drop should be around -7 LUFS. And that's usually, if you achieve that goal, then you are usually in the right ballpark to compete with your favorite artists. There are tracks which are even louder, and even in techno, there are tracks which are mastered at like -5 LUFS, and they are very loud and very aggressive. But if you can't get it to -7, you're still close enough so that people will still play your tracks, like your tracks, and you have like a similar sound. And my personal goal is to master at roughly, in the loudest part of my track, master at roughly -6 LUFS. And you have to think about it, it's just the loudest part of my track. If you play the track from start to beginning, the measurement or the value of the measured loudest or the integrated loudest will of course be a lot less than the loudest part, because we have a lot of like quieter parts in the track, in the breakdowns and in the intro and outro, and then maybe you will get an integrated reading of like maybe only -9 or -10 LUFS overall over the whole track, but measure it in the loudest part of your drops. And if you are at, let's say, -7 LUFS, then you're close enough. You can still get a little bit more like that, but it always depends on the genre. For example, if you have a like very melodic techno track, then maybe -7 or -8 is enough. But if you have a like very aggressive and hard industrial techno track, maybe you have to do a little bit more and go to like -6 LUFS, and because you just need some extra aggressiveness, hotness, and dance in the mix to really stand up to your favorite artists. And yeah, so there's no magic number, but you have to compare it to other tracks in your genre and see, okay, at which volume levels are they mastered. Then you have to master at a similar level. Don't need to hit exactly the same, but at least on a similar level. And my approach here is that I don't think that if you're mastering your own tracks, you should not be correcting a lot of issues there, because mastering should just be about making your sound, just polishing the sound you already have, not fixing stuff and problems you created in the mixing or in the production. You just have to make the sound just a little bit better and hit your final loudness targets. And that's the concept I use for mastering. So my mastering is basically just coloring the mix with some saturation plugins, classic console emulations, tape machine emulations, and yeah, stuff like that, to just give the mix a little bit more warmth and saturation. And then I will use a multiband compressor just to get the right volume balance in all frequency band, and use some compression on parts where it's needed. And then I will hit the final limiters, and sometimes I use, or in a lot of cases, I use just a little bit about dynamic processing, where, for example, I use then the newfangled audio punctuate just to add back a little bit of transients, because usually the transients will get softened a little bit in the final limiting stage. So I will add that before to just compensate for the loss of transients in the limiting stage. And that's basically all I do. If you have to like fix a lot of problems in your mastering, for example, you have to do like crazy EQ stuff, then the problem is in the mixing or it's already in the production. And you should fix all the stuff at the stage where it occurs and not in the mastering stage. And that's one advantage if you master in the same projects. I know it's sometimes, for a lot of people, it's problematic because your CPU just can't handle it. But for example, here in Ableton, you can freeze and flatten your tracks. And this will help a lot with the CPU to still do that. And so, for example, if I master my track and then I see, okay, I have some problems in my lead sounds and I have some clashing frequencies, I will not fix it with the mastering EQ. I will go to the individual channel and then just fix the problem there. So that's why I basically, I rarely use any EQ in the mastering stage. For example, here you can see the mastering EQ is just doing a low cut and a high cut just to get rid of the frequencies which are not needed, and just to clean it up, and that's basically it. Then I use some multiband compressing. For example, here I have just a band to compress the mid-lows. The mid-low frequencies are in a lot of cases are a bit problematic, because if you have too much dynamics there, it's usually a little bit wobbly and doesn't sound right. So you have to make sure that all your frequency bands have enough compression, or should not be over compressed. For example, you shouldn't over compress the high end, because that sounds very annoying. But on the low end and also in the sub area, you should make sure that you have a very dense and compressed mix, because you don't want to have a lot of volume jumps in these bands. And that's why I use the FabFilter Pro MB here, just to compress a little bit the low mid-range area here around 270 hertz. It's basically usually at around 100 to 300 hertz, but it's problematic area. And I will just compress it a little bit here. So it's not doing a lot. And yeah, as I already said, in mastering, it's not necessary to do a lot. It's just small steps, just small polishing steps to make your sound even better. And then I go to my Lin MB from Waves. It's a linear phase multiband compression. And here I just have 5 bands set up. The first band is just the very low and the sub frequencies. So I just do some shaping here, and I set up the compression on the bands where I think it just needs a little bit more compression. For example, you can see that here on the high bands I don't have any compression at all. I just boost the volume a little bit to get the correct overall frequency response I want to. And I can just play it here, see. You see the bands are just jumping around a little bit, and I've already limited the range here at minus 5 dB, so it just will not compress more than 5 dB at max. But here in my setting, it's usually maybe maximum 2 or 3 dB of compression, but that's usually more than enough. And then the next stage is the dynamic stage. Here I have the Slate Digital FGX, which is a mastering compressor from Slate Digital, but I don't use it for any kind of compression or limiting. I just use this plugin here for this dynamic perception setting, and I don't know exactly what it does, but what they try to do is to bring back some perceived dynamics to the overall mix, because in the final limiting stages the perceived or the dynamics will get reduced and the crest factor will be lowered, but it's it just creates a sound which seems to have more dynamics than it actually has. I think it's some transient shaping or multiband transient shaping, but I'm not sure what it exactly does. But it just makes the mix sound like it has a little bit more dynamics than it actually has. And that's why I use this plugin, just for that reason. And also here the newfangled punctuate. I just use it here very slightly, just to add a little bit of sharpness to the transient, and then I will put these transients into the clipping stage where I just square them off, which will make the transients even more aggressive. but this is just for compensating for the loss of transients in the limiting stage, and to make the track overall a little bit more dynamic again. And in between we have the Galfos plugin. It's one of my favorite plugins just for like fixing the sound overall, as I have already told in the mixing video. It's like a dynamic EQ, and I use it at a very low setting here. You can see that I have the recover and tame just at 20%, and it just cleans up the sound a little bit and makes it like more upfront. It's a subtle effect, but it's noticeable. And the cool thing about it is that it's analyzing the sound in real time. So a lot of like dynamic EQs have the problem you have to set up the bands and you have to set up the settings. But usually the settings are only relevant to one section of your track. For example, in the breakdown, you have different sounds, or the frequency response is different than in the drop. And then it's like problematic to set up a static EQ like that, which works in all parts of your track. And that's a big advantage of Galfos, is that it will analyze the sound all the time, and this frequency response reacts to the analyzed signal. And so you can just set up the settings here, which will work fine for your track, and then it will automatically adapt to the sound which is currently playing. And that's just why I use it, and it works really good for that. And yeah, then that's already like the coloring sections. Also, yeah, we have to go here to the pre-master, because there my saturation stage is actually in this project. As I told you, in my newer projects, I don't have this pre-master channel anymore, and I will just use a master channel where also my saturation plugins are. And for saturation, I just use FabFilter Saturn here, and I've made my own preset here, which is a 4-band tube and tape master. On the low bands, I use a warm tube setting, because I like the tube setting the most on the lower frequencies, because they will add like a certain warmth and punch to the sound. And on the mid or high mid frequencies, I mostly use tape, and on the very highs I use the clean tape, just to make it a little bit more bright and shiny. And I use very low settings here, usually like maybe 15. It's the maximum. I would go 20%. Depends also on the track. On some tracks I just use like 10%, but it depends on how saturated the mix already is. You can also do like here a parallel mix if you want to. And yeah, that's just the first stage. And then I will hit here the virtual tape machine from Slate Digital, which is a very cool plugin. And you have to set up this plugin also already when you're doing your mix downs, because this plugin will add a lot of low frequencies and a lot of sub energy. And if you just put this plugin on your master and put your finished mix into it, it will like enhance the low end too much, and then you will get problems. But I've already set up this chain in my mixing stage, so I already know that this plugin will add some low end, and then I can just reduce the volume on the individual channels a little bit and get the right result. And this plugin just emulates a tape machine, and the tape machine adds just a little bit of distortion and also slightly some compression if you overdrive it, and it's gets like a warmth and like hard to describe sound, but it's a really pleasing sound. And that's why I use always tape emulation plugins, and especially this plugin on my master chain. Then we have the imager. It's the old imager, and my new project I already have the new one. Just to do some stereo imaging. And if you look at the settings, you might say, okay, that looks crazy. This guy is boosting its high mids and high frequencies like crazy. And yes, it looks crazy, but only if you just look at the values without looking at what I already did at the mix down. Because like I said, it's usually, or my basic concept is to mix into a specific mastering chain, and this imager is already set up in my chain. So if I mix all my sounds, I always like compensate for like the enhanced stereo width I do in this plugin. But usually, of course, the settings are not like that. I set it up, let's say here about like 40 or 50% in both bands, and then I will mix into that. But I already compensate for the enhanced stereo width. So sounds which should not have too much stereo information, I will already reduce the stereo field in these sounds. But the sound which should be stereo will benefit from this plugin. And that's why you have to set up this chain very early, because you have to compensate for the enhanced stereo width of your sound to not get phase problem or phase correlation problems in your sound, so that they will sound very weak in mono. So that's also something to keep in mind. And yeah, you always, and if you do like stereo with enhancing, always check back the sound in mono. Usually I mix during mixing, I often mix for some time in mono, especially if I do some EQ decisions and like trying to see how the layers will add up. I mix in mono, because if you have a clean sound in mono, it will, like in 99% of the cases, it will sound good in stereo as well. I've never had the case where it didn't sound right in stereo, because the thing is, if you work in stereo, you can separate your sounds, just for example, by putting them on the left side or on the right side, and it will sound like they are not clashing. But if you put them together in mono, the sounds will clash. For example, let's say you put like a bass sound on the left side and another bass sound on the right side. If you play it in stereo, it will sound okay. You say, yeah, you have the bass sound on the left and the bass on the right, and sounds okay. But then if you put them into mono, and for example, if the phase correlation is not exactly the same on both sounds, then they will cancel each other out to a certain extent. And then you will get problems, but you will not notice it as long as you play your song in stereo. And since a lot of club systems are still in mono for some reasons, you have to check that your sounds still sound good in mono. So always keep that in mind while you're doing a mix. All right, and then, yeah, basically, so we have now made the sound very clean and like added some warmth and distortion, and now everything sounds good. And the final step is now just to get the right volume level. And as I told you, usually I aim for -6 LUFS in the loudest drop. And so the first step is then to set up the clipper. Here in this project, I used the standard clip. In my newer project, I use the clipper from Newfangled Audio because it's a spectral clipper and it's just a little bit cleaner because just this how the clippers work, and this kind of spectral clipper just takes into account that the low frequencies have more energy, and then it will compensate for that, and clipping is clipping the high frequencies a little bit more than low frequencies and balances it out a little bit. But if you do just here clipping in the mastering stage and just do 1 or 2 dB of clipping, then there usually is basically no difference at all between all those clippers. And a standard clip is a really good plugin. It's really cheap. It's I think it's like 20 or 25 euros or something, so it's really affordable, and it has a really good sound, and also some different settings you can play around with them. It's really cool, and it also has a very cool function here. You can use oversampling, which is very important. to use oversampling in the plugins which saturate your sounds, for example, like limiters, clippers, saturators. You have to use oversampling because otherwise you will get aliasing effects and they sound very bad and unnatural, and you have to avoid it. And just the easiest solution is to use oversampling. Problem with oversampling is that it uses a lot of CPU, so that's why this setting here is really cool, because you can set a different oversampling factor for offline and online rendering. So while you're playing the track here live in your DAW, I can just set the oversampling factor to factor 2. So that will not use a lot of CPU. So I can still do all my stuff in my DAW without using too much CPU. But then if I render the track and export it, I can use a different oversampling factor. And here for exporting, I use 16 times oversampling, and this will use a lot of CPU. But I don't care if it takes a little bit longer to export the track. But it just makes sure that I will not get any aliasing artifacts in my final export, and that the sound will be very clean at the final stage. So that's why this setting is really cool, and I think it's the only plugin I know which has like the possibility to set something up. I wish the Pro L2 would have a similar setting, because it uses a lot of CPU as well if you put it on 16 times oversampling. But usually I just enable the oversampling for exporting, and while I work I just maybe switch it on and off to see how it sounds. But it takes up too much CPU to work all the time with that much oversampling. But just keep in mind, use oversampling if your plugin has it, because if you do a lot of clipping or limiting, you will get aliasing effects and artifacts, and they will not sound good at all. So yeah, just let's see what it does. Actually, in my newer projects, I use just hard clip with the newfangled audio plugin. Here on this occasion, I use the ratio 2:1 setting, and it's basically a combination of limiting and clipping. It has two stages. The first stage is just a compression stage, and it will compress the sound with a 2:1 ratio. So everything which goes above the threshold will be reduced 50% in volume, and the other 50%, which after the first stage is still over the threshold, will get clipped. So it's a combination of limiting and clipping, and it has a very crisp sound, and that's why I use this setting here. And I used very little soft clipping just to add a little bit more saturation. So soft clipping just means that the plugin will start to saturate the sound a little bit even before the threshold is hit. In some cases this can be useful, or it adds like a certain sound character or a certain type of saturation which you like, then you can use it. But if you want to be as transparent as possible, then just use hard clip, because hard clip will be the most transparent setting, because it will just clip everything above the threshold, and everything below the threshold will be untouched. So in this case, we can just play it here. We can see it's most of the time it's just clipping like 1 or 2 dB. In some cases maybe 3 dB, but that's usually the maximum. And so that's only very short and spiky transients which will get squared off in this stage, just to save the final limiter from having to do too much work. And so we just get here some additional headroom for the final limiter, so that the limiter has not to work on all these very sharp transients as well. And if you think, okay, can I use a compressor for that as well? Yeah, the answer is yeah, some of them yes, and some of them no. Because the thing about compressors is that like the basic compressors, even if you set them at the fastest attack, which is sometimes about like 0.1 milliseconds, it still can't catch the transients. Even if it's 0.1 milliseconds, it's still a little bit of a transient which is going through the compressor and which will hit the limiter. And that's why I use clippers. And every brick wall limiter is basically a clipper in the final stage, because they first will do some compression and limiting, but everything which passes through the first stages of compression and limiting will get clipped at the end of the limiter. So most of your limiters are clippers as well, if they are brick wall limiters. So yeah, you can also use compression, but just keep in mind that only the plugins which have a look ahead setting, they will be able to catch all the peaks, because they can analyze the signal in front. They have some look ahead, so they can already see what signal is coming in and then react to it. But if your compressor has no look ahead setting, then it will not be able to catch the very, very short peaks. And for that reason, I use the clipper, because it will catch everything which is going above the threshold. And then I will just hit the final mastering limiter, which is in my case the FabFilter Pro L2. It's one of the best limiters right now which you can get. The newfangled Audio One Elevate is also very good, but I still prefer the FabFilter one, because I worked with this limiter most of the time, so I know it inside out. And it also has like a cool here loudness meter where you can check everything, and it has a lot of presets. And I use a specific setting here. I use the aggressive mode, which is like very close to clipping, so it will also clip the transient stuff, and will not limit the transients too hard so that they will get too soft. And also it has a lot of other styles, and for example here the modern style has a great sound as well. But yeah, just compare the settings and see which setting works best for your track, because in some cases other settings will work better than the others. And yeah, that's just basically it. And then I will just add here like 3 dB of additional gain, and then we will here get some additional limiting. Okay, as you can see, we just have around 3 dB or 3.5 dB of gain reduction, and are already here on our final loudness target, which is about -6 LUFS in the loudest part of the second drop. And so we have reached our loudest target, but as you can see, I have not crushed the mix too much. I've just used here like 3 or 3.5 dB of gain reduction in my final stage. And that's only possible because I have reduced all the transients, and I've clipped or limited all the transients in the earlier stages in the mix. I've used a limiter on my lead sounds, I've clipped my drum sounds, then I have clipped the transients in the master channel as well. And that enabled me to just use only 3 dB of more of gain in my final limiter to achieve my goal of -6 LUFS. And some people, if you don't do all these earlier stages, then you have to maybe like set the final limiter to 6 or 7 dB of gain reduction or even more. And this will just result in a very bad sound, because the limiter can't handle that much gain reduction. It will just fall apart. It will sound very bad and over compressed. And that's the trick. And that's why a lot of people think you can't master your tracks at a certain volume level without having them over compressed. And the problem is that this is not true in a lot of cases, because you have just do the right steps in the right stages to get on a certain volume level without having it over compressed. And that's just the step you need. The steps you need. You have to take care of the peaks in all your sounds in the summing groups in a very early stage to get to these high volume levels without being completely over compressed. And that's just like the magic behind it. And you can try it out in your own projects. It takes some time to really understand how it works, and it might not work in the first project where you try to do it, because you have to invest some time to really understand it and how it works and how you have to set up everything. But just give it a try when you're mixing and mastering your next track. Just put on a basic mastering chain with like 4 or 5 dB of gain reduction, and then mix into the chain, and you will see that it will save up a lot of time, because the volume levels will be set up correctly straight from the beginning. And then if you do the real mastering, you don't have to do a lot of balancing again, because all the sounds are already at the correct volume level. You will just have to do a little bit of final balancing and saturation, like coloring your mix to enhance it and polish it a little bit more, and then do the final, just getting to the final target loudness of your track. And always keep in mind, don't just crush it because you think it has to. Analyze mixes and tracks in your specific genre, and then just see, okay, at which target loudness are they? And then you can already see, okay, I have to be in that range, in that loudness range. And then just, use that information to get your mixes into the same ballpark as your favorite artists. But some genres will be louder than others. It's usually, if the genre is more aggressive, then it's very likely that the tracks are mastered louder than softer genres. For example, if you have a really like deep house, melodic, techno style, then probably it's enough to have it at around -7 or -8 LUFS. But if you do like very heavy industrial techno, then maybe your favorite artists will have their mixes mastered at -5 LUFS, just because it adds even more saturation and hotness to their tracks, and that's why they're doing it. So just think about like that, and maybe it will make sense to you as well. That's basically my approach, how I do my mastering. And if you like that, just try it out and see how it goes. It might not work for all people, and that's okay, because there are a lot of solutions to the same problem. And in music production, there are thousands of ways to achieve the same result. This is just one way to do it. And if you like that way and if it works for you, just do it. Don't care about what others say. And if it doesn't work, then just throw it away and find your own way how to work. And you have to find a solution which works for you. That's the most important thing, because if it works for you, then it's good. If you can achieve quick and consistent results with your technique, then it's great, no matter what the technique is. For example, in techno, we have a lot of techniques which are like considered wrong in all other genres. For example, let's think about another genre where you can put reverb on your kick drum or on your sub bass, or create a sub bass out of reverb or delay. People would call you crazy if you do that in other genres. They would say, yeah, it's insane, well, it's completely stupid. Yeah, but guess what? People didn't give a fuck and just did it and created techno bass lines out of reverb or delay. And it worked. And that's the point. In music production, there are no rules, there are no boundaries. The rules and the boundaries are only in your head. Just break them and just see if it works or not. And if it works, it's great. And if it doesn't work, it's not great. Simple as that. So just keep that in mind. Try out new things. and don't let you tell people otherwise. Yeah, that's my recommendation for everyone. So I hope you learned something. If you have any questions about the recent episodes, or if I have forgot to tell about something, then just let me know, and yeah, I will answer all your comments and questions. Thanks for staying with me all the time. It was a pleasure to do the tutorial, and it was really fun. I hope it helped some of you, and you learned something new. Yeah, let's see you in the next tutorial. Thanks for staying with me. Goodbye.